This time we look at 5 more affordable Japanese classics. How does one describe a classic motorcycle? For some it has to be a British or European motorcycle, and a Japanese bike will simply never do. But other people are far less prescriptive, and indeed it's a sad indication of the march of time that many of the bikes that I would ride when I was younger have now been regarded as classic machines. And while the prices of some Japanese 70s bikes have gone crazy, bikes in the 1980s are much more affordable. And here are 5 great ones. The Yamaha XJ series. Yamaha's XJs, like so many of the Japanese bikes of the period, were crosser-frame 4s available in a whole range of sizes. But for this video I'm going to concentrate on 2 of the more popular models, the 600 and the 900. The 900 arrived first in 1983 and in its original form was of 851cc. All models were the usual crosser-frame 4-cylinder air-cooled units with dual overhead cams, and just the 2 valves per cylinder, so although top-end power wasn't quite as good as later 4-valve models, mid-range punch is often better. Although the main difference between the 6 and the 900 was that the 900 used shaft drive rather than chain. The 600cc model would arrive a year later in 1984 and would be of 598cc, and with a claimed peak power of 72 horsepower, which is put through a 6-speed gearbox. Both machines would indeed sell pretty well, although both were overshadowed to some extent by their Kawasaki equivalents, with the GPZ 900, largely thanks to that Top Gun association and its more advanced liquid-cooled engine, was definitely seen as the bike to have. But there's really nothing wrong with the XJs. They offer respectable performance, and the handling is pretty competent too, and that fairing offers reasonable protection at higher speeds, making them very capable mile munchers, particularly the 900 with its shaft drive. But there would be interesting variants. For the 900, the larger FJ 1100 and later 1200 did compete with the bike for its sports tourer role, although they didn't have shaft drive. And there were some unusual variants too, the wildest of which was the XJ 650 Turbo, built during Japan's short-term flotation with compressors. The Honda VFR 750. Honda pretty much stunned the world in the early 80s when they introduced their all-new V4 range, a range of bikes ranging from 400cc all the way up to the full litre class. The new bikes were stylish, modern looking and powerful, and to me as a young guy at that time they looked like the future, because it wasn't long before problems began to emerge very quickly with the top end of the motors, poor quality soft camshafts, inefficient oil supply, and of course cam chain problems. Indeed, for Honda the whole thing was something of a financial and of course a PR disaster. Honda moved quickly, they do have resources, and in 1986 introduced the VFR 750, a complete reworking with a different firing order and a completely redesigned top end with gear driven cams. And indeed the VFR and its many variants did a great deal to restore Honda's reputation. Build quality on the machines was second to none, and indeed even press reviews of the time described the bike as a classic of the modern era. And if any Japanese bike of the 1980s could be counted as a classic, surely the VFR is it. The bike was fitted with an engine of 748cc, with a bore and stroke of 70 by 48mm. Honda would claim a peak power of 104 horsepower, although in reality it's about 10 horsepower down on that, but still nothing to be sniffed at by mid-80s standards. And nor was the bike's excellent 6-speed transmission. The machine made use of an aluminium beam frame, still not that common in the mid-80s. And this gave the bike much better handling than its predecessors, a fact much helped by the use of more conventional wheel sizes. And despite all the tech, the machine was also a fair bit lighter also, with a wet weight of 226 kilos or 498 pounds. Although this does mean the bike is still no lightweight, something an Achilles heel for the VFRs over the years, and something that would push the bike towards the sports tourer end of the market as more sporty transverse 4s began to appear in the latter part of the 80s. But as a sports tourer the bike would have no equal. The combination of build quality and characterful engine made it a class leader, and while opposition like the Triumph Sprint ST would come and go, the Honda would remain top dog. Kawasaki's ZZR range. It seems strange to think of the ZZR 1100 and 600 as classics, but in fact the 1100 arrived way back in 1989. The 1100 arrived as a replacement for the earlier ZX10 with a superior chassis and more refined engine design, and indeed would take the crown of the ZX10 as the fastest production bike then available, with a top speed of 176 miles an hour, a crown it would hold through until 1996 and the arrival of the Honda Blackbird. Both the 6 and the 1100 made awesome fast touring machines, with even the smaller bike capable of around 150 miles an hour, making it the fastest production 600 then available. And whilst not exactly sports bikes in the purest sense, they offered a Gran Turismo feel, great comfort and great performance all wrapped into one, including good passenger comfort, something which many of its competitors did not. The 1100 was fitted with an across-the-frame 4 of 1052 cc's, with a bore and stroke of 76 by 52. Kawasaki would claim peak power of 147 horsepower at 10,500 rpm, with a dry weight of 228 kilos or 502 pounds. The smaller 600 would arrive in 1994 and featured a 599cc engine with a bore and stroke of 64 by 46.6. Peak power was acclaimed 98 horsepower at 11,500 rpm, enough to push the 216 kilo or 476 pound bike along at just over 150 miles an hour. Both bikes are plentiful, having enjoyed long production runs, with production engine in 2001 for the 1100, with the 600 being replaced in 1995 by the more sporty ZX6. The Suzuki Bandit. Suzuki's Bandit was available in a whole range of sizes, from 400 to 600, 750 in some markets, and indeed the mighty 1200. And it was a bike that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. They took the older engine from their GSXRs, modified them slightly, and placed them in steel tubular frames. And the resulting machine was an absolute bargain and a massive sales success for Suzuki. And that steel frame even outperformed the aluminium frames from the Gixxers to boot. The bike was rugged and refreshingly simple, and would set a trend for the next decade for naked middleweight machines available at a low price. And while it's true that Honda's later Hornet and Yamaha's Phaser would be faster and more powerful, they did lack the character of the basic Bandit. In the UK, the 600 was by far the most popular. It used the GSX-F engine, which was of 599cc with a bore and stroke of 62 by 48.7. Compression ratio was 11.3 to 1, and overall the bike claimed 77 horsepower at 10,500 rpm. With its steel chassis, the bike weighed in at 208 kilos or 459 pounds, and it was a very sturdy chassis, providing excellent handling, with the only blot on the bike's copybook being the overly soft front suspension, which had a tendency to dive when you really hit the brakes hard. The 1200 by comparison can be seen as essentially the same bike with a much larger engine, somehow shoehorned in, and all that weight at the front does of course negatively affect the handling, the 1200 feeling much heavier steering than the light and nimble 600. And while the top speed of around 145 doesn't seem a lot for such a big bike, the torque of that big characterful motor more than compensates. The Honda CX500. The first Honda CX model looked nothing like this snazzy turbo bike we can see before us. The first bike arrived in 1978 and was clearly aimed at BMW's and Motor Guts's market share. But though similar in appearance to the European twins, in concept is very different and can best be managed as an inline or conventional V-twin turned through 90 degrees with a shaft place where the sprocket would be. In effect, this means that the transmission lies alongside the crankshaft, sealed neatly inside the crankcase. This notionally means that the gearbox running in the opposite direction to the crank should balance out the torque reaction of the engine, and of course it does allow for a shorter wheelbase. But in reality what happened was the bike didn't really handle any better than the Gutsis, in fact somewhat worse. And all the Honda's worry about torque reaction was all for naught, because in reality it has minimal effect on the bike once it's on the move. Other major differences are that the V-twin is of 80 rather than 90 degrees, which is something which can lead to a small amount of buzziness. My thumb used to go asleep, for example. But that big water-cooled engine with its 4 valves might be fairly heavy, but it's also very torquey for its size, so the bike is excellent on the road and can cover huge mileages with no problem at all. But the first models were not without their problems. Crank failures were known, certainly on the initial models, and there were some problems with the cam chain, something which I can testify remained a problem even on the later models. The first model was the basic, fairly ugly and fairly wobbly Roadster. This was later joined by the C model or Custom, which made use of a smaller back wheel to make the handling even worse. And these featured styling which was, well, let's say interesting. Incidentally, these bikes would form the bulk of the machines that we now see as custom calf racers today. The C model would also form the basis of the latest Silverwing, think Honda Goldwing, but a little bit smaller. However, 1982 would see a major upgrade of the machine with the EC or Eurosport. This model would see totally refreshed styling, so it looked a lot better, and the handling was also better courtesy of a new monoshock suspension system. And this model was also available as a 64 horsepower 650 and the turbo, of course. The 500 was of 497 cc's with a bore and stroke of 78 by 52. Compression ratio was 10:1 and Honda claimed 50 horsepower for the Eurosport model. The 650 was of 673 cc's with a bore and stroke of 82.5 by 63. And both models would be available with a compressor for the CX650 and 500 turbos. And with Honda claiming 76 horsepower for the 500 and a nice round 100 horsepower for the 650, these bikes are handily quick. And that really sums up the CX500, a truly groundbreaking bike. Liquid cooling, overhead valves, 4 valves per cylinder, and Comstar wheels that made it the first bike to be sold as standard with tubeless tyres. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.